On discovery. Great. Okay. So one thing that we talked about with VSM, which was really interesting, or sorry, with workflows, is that we know we're going to build VSM in the future. So one thing that we've been talking about, really wanted to just get your thoughts on, is that we're really leaning toward calling not calling this custom workflows for a number of reasons. One of them is just an obvious reasons, like we don't call them custom labels or custom milestones or custom whatever, as Sean brought up. Hey, Eric. So I'm just bringing Mark up to speed really quickly on the value workflows concept. And so we knew, or as our designer Annabelle was working on this, she started doing some designs and really hit me, or maybe she knew it all along, but that these were really building. Our goal is not to build custom workflows. We can think of it as a means and end to build value streams. So we're really excited, or I mean, I'm really excited that I think we should just call this value workflows, or maybe like business value workflows, or just something, just take out the word custom and really emphasize like the business and the value and those sort of buzzy words. So just wanted to share that with you, and if you have any immediate thoughts on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I'm really excited by this whole thing because of the value stream stuff. I don't know necessarily what you should call it per se, but doing it something with value stream actually does make sense. Like even workflow is to some extent the synonym for stream. And so like if you just said, actually what we're doing is letting you define your value stream and
Exactly.
then sort of just jump to the end result instead of sort of going through, oh, well, we're actually just doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah, we're jumping to the definition of a stream. Agree.
Awesome. All right, so let's jump into the meat of the discussion. Eric, I am already recording. You might notice. So I put this doc together. It's in the agenda. I just put this together, Eric, this morning. So you might not see it yet, but it is in the agenda. Mark already clicked in. So thank you, Mark. So really quickly, I've outlined a couple of points why I think doing it with a
just quickly before you jump in, though,
please.
Is everything that's here already covered in the issue before the comment, or is there new information here?
There is, I think a lot of this is rehashed. I put this, I mean, at the end of this meeting, I'll definitely attach this, like we should just delete this document.
Of course.
And then I'll attach all this to the issue. But I try to just put all my thoughts together and summarize. So okay. To me, it's the analysis of any product implementation we should analyze in a couple of ways. Just how the user experiences it. You've talked a lot about small primitives being a strategic approach to a lot of building product in general. So when I think about the word strategy, and it's really about, to me, how much time does it take to build the feature now, or not time, but really effort. How is it good for iteration? Are we mitigating risks? Long term, how does it make sense to continue to maintain it, or how much effort it takes to maintain it? Are you introducing more complexity? So I wanted to address all those points, and I tried to lay out all those here. And then, for example, I said user experience overloading labels has been confusing with its many uses up to now. I think a first-class experience is a better intuitive experience. And then also the flip side, it's not just about creating workflows. It's about creating, maintaining labels, which people have complained for many good reasons. And so you're interrupting labels as well. It's not just about workflows. So user experience, I think, is a key point. Effort required to make the feature. The initial effort, I think, takes more effort to do. Build it on top of the labels, because precisely you have to build on top of labels. And you might, you get certain things for free, but I'll talk about why that's actually not relevant. But definitely you add things into the sidebar. You have to add so the only thing you get, quote unquote, for free with labels is just the object itself. So I will definitely agree with that. But overall, as a feature, as an MVC, for example, so the way we've carved out the MVC from a design perspective is just two things, right? And you need to configure it somehow, and you need to show it on the issue display, like the issue page. And so, for example, you don't need an issue board, right? That definitely does not an MVC. You don't need any type of VSM UI, right? So as an MVC, all you need to do is, so this current plan is to build it from a configuration screen, and we've chosen group, and we can talk about that maybe even in a separate call, but we want to do it in groups for now instead of projects. And so we need some type of configuration there. And we'll probably ship that and maybe put that behind a feature flag if we can't do the issue display in the same milestone. But to me, like just this feature, you have to have those two components. And having those two components with labels means you have to do all that work anyway. So I don't see a huge benefit, if any, to do it with labels. Effort required to do VSM, I think, is the biggie here, because same points as above, but the really salient point is the timing. And we've talked a lot about this in the past 6 months, if not longer, with really nailing it down with labels, because we thought the history is that we wanted to build VSM on top of label boards before. And so we spent a lot of time talking about labels. We spent a lot of time talking about, oh, if this label belongs to a board, then we consider it a workflow label, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity to maintain there, and initial effort required to categorize a label as a workflow label, and then to add timing information to that. So there's effort involved there to make that work, as opposed to using it a first-class object, then it's separate. Long-term effort to maintain feature, obviously the downside is there's just more things there if you introduce a new abstraction. But we're not comparing doing nothing, right? We're comparing to building more things, right? So when you're building more things, by definition, there's more code to maintain. And so I would argue, would you like to maintain more code with a new abstraction, or would you like to maintain more code with an existing object that has more use cases, more edge cases, more like, labels? You can have project labels, group labels. Now you can have workflow labels. You have labels in the admin. There's these things called admin labels that not a lot of people know about, but they're like configured per instance, and you copy them when you create a project. So there's all these additional edge cases if you want to build on top of labels. And then finally, I wanted to emphasize, and I'm going through this really quickly, Mark, because I want this to be a discussion. And finally, I wanted to mention that duplicating similar functionality for labels, I think that's the greatest argument for small primitives, the concept in this in particular. So I thought about this again very deeply, and I don't think there's a lot of benefits here. So with, in the contrast, I thought a lot about is for custom fields. I think that is, so that's why I'm not totally convinced key value labels is the answer, is the first iteration, but I'm willing to put that as what we've stated as the next iteration out there in GitLab, and then we can continue to argue as we get closer. But to me, custom fields is something to be argued more, because they're just like labels, right? You're just tagging something as a field, and then there's this additional thing about maybe mutual exclusion and then a little bit more constraints, but they're essentially labels, and like from a gut feeling or however you want to analyze it, I think we would all agree. But workflow stages, to me, there's something separate. They're more akin to a milestone, a weight, a assignee. These are different attributes to an issue. So they share similarities to labels from that comparison, but the features and use cases are so separate. So for example, if you were to use small primitives, a benefit is that filtering by issues by a label, filtering issues by assignee, you get that for free, quote unquote, right? You get that for free with system notes. You get that for free, where else? In the issue sidebar, right? So you get a lot of things, quote unquote, for free. But on closer examination with workflow stages, I think system note is the only thing that you really get for free, if that's a small marginal benefit, and it's not even a first-class user experience, because you just say like added label, remove label, and then even that's already proven to be confusing, because people always see that with workflow boards right now with labels, and they ask questions like, this should be combined because you're adding a label and removing a label. Can you indicate that this is a board label? So it's already proven to be confusing, first of all. So we would need to improve it if we were to use labels. And then the other proposed or purported benefit is in the sidebar. We said that if we use labels, even for key value labels, we would need to put it in a different place if we wanted it to be a stage. And again, that's true for like a really, really small MVC, but the next iteration you probably want, and in our current design, you want that stage next to the open, closed badge anyways in the top left. So you get the benefit for one iteration, and you already have to move that to the top left. So I don't see a benefit there. Filtering by issue and searching it on the lists view. again, I don't see a benefit there because we shouldn't actually allow people as a design to filter by stage from there, because we should actually do it from the configuration view and the VSM view. And so Annabelle actually has some designs there, so I can dig into those in a second. But again, I don't want to dominate this conversation too much without me just talking. So I think I hit all the points I really wanted to get out. So I'll let Eric and Mark jump in however they want.
Awesome, thanks for that. So first of all, I appreciate the thorough look at it and the balanced view, and I appreciate that you've looked at the issue from a variety of angles and then come up with a conclusion. The pieces that I would like to highlight that might have been missing, at least from the argument, one small piece and then three important ones. One is when you talk about the long-term effort to maintain, well, actually, sorry, no. When you talk about we're not duplicating similar functionality for labels, one of the things that's often forgotten about is like the API. And a lot of times the API lags, for example. And so you talked about like, oh, the only thing is like, oh, you get system notes for free. Well, you also get an API for free. You can already have, if you were using labels, then you'd have an API for manipulating labels. You'd have a way to query it. Any workflows based on those things would already work. And just be a convention of then how you use them on top. But the more important issue for me is about leverage. Because if you look only at custom workflows as a feature, or even in this case, you've extended that to VSM, and you look at those two features and say how this works for those two features, you come to a certain conclusion, because like the bang for buck to deliver it, X versus Y, and you compare that between the two options, and you might say that, well, it's roughly speaking the same, maybe one's slightly better, one's not. But what isn't easy to factor in is the unknown leverage. And that's one of the key benefits of the small primitives. So for example, when I paint this picture and I say, look, we've got custom workflows and it's going to work for custom workflows, and you've already talked about how you're going to make it work for VSM. I have a later concern about whether it's really going to work for VSM properly, or if VSM is going to need something else, but we can dig into that. But even assuming that it works for those two things, does it work for things outside of custom workflows? Like one of the nice things about label sets is just it can be used in 5 different features. It can be used for custom workflows. It can be used to enforce that stuff, but it can also just be used to pretty up and categorize things. It can just be used for like, I want to have just multiple labels simultaneously of different kinds of things. I want a bug report to be able to have what OS were you on, what version were you on, whatever it is. And I want just a whole bunch of different, all the arguments for label sets. And I expect that or at least there's a very high likelihood, in my estimation anyway, that if we do this stuff for custom workflows, like we'll say, okay, well, to cut scope, we're going to make custom workflow. We're going to only have you one thing. We're going to call it a stage. And we're going to say like, there's this one workflow label that you can apply to all issues, because that's usually how we do. So let's do it for one. And then but then that means like, great, well, but I want to be able to just tag things with an OS, and has nothing to do with a workflow. It's just, I want to tag this thing. It's, oh, well, you don't have that because we cut that scope. It's not part of workflows. So this focus on doing workflows means you just lose that opportunity to have a feature work for 5 other use cases. And it's even like, even if you can come up with the 5 cases now, there's going to be 5 more use cases that your customers are going to come up with that you just never even considered. And so for me, if it's even at all close as to which one is going to be like, okay, effort versus reward, I would just heavily weight the small primitive with its higher leverage is going to have a much bigger bang than we normally account for. And so like, if it's argue that it's like 5x, like, oh, like, let's say both of these solutions solve the same problem. Let's say they both solve them ideally, exactly the same. The interface looks exactly the same, whatever. So then it's just about effort. And you're saying, okay, one's a little bit less effort. But what you're missing then is, but actually the smaller primitive isn't just solving the same, it's not providing the same bang, it's providing 5x that bang, because it works for this and four other cases plus these other, maybe those other cases aren't as important. So, the calculus gets more complicated, but the point is it's a bigger bang. And so it's a bigger bang for potentially more effort. Now, I would also, though, argue that normally small primitives are also less effort. And one of the other big points I wrote down is about iteration and decoupling in general, but iteration. The problem with making a first-class thing is that you can do an MVC and you'll cut scope until it fits in one iteration, but the chance of that being viable in that iteration are pretty low. It's like, oh, well, we added this thing, but you can't do anything with it yet. Like, it doesn't actually enforce anything. We can't really.
Let's argue specifics then, or not argue.
Sure.
Can you outline what you mean by that specifically in this case?
Well, it's hard because I don't know exactly what your sequence is, but
we can talk about it.
I can, yeah, well, we only have 10 more minutes though, so I don't want to get too much into a specific. So I actually really like to stay at a high level and just say, normally in all evidence that I've seen before when we've done similar things, epics would be a good example. It took months before epics were actually usable because like you couldn't delete them, you couldn't tag them, you couldn't do these things with them. We tried to make use of them, and I know you created several epics in the beginning, but I didn't use them for 6 months because they were just not viable for me. Whereas if we had gone a different path, I believe we could.
Right. I've argued this point. I've explained this point to you multiple times, Mark. Epics we did small primitives where epics are issuables in the backend. So they are small primitives. I don't know why you're using that as a proof point. It's not.
Obviously, I disagree.
We did, like, if anything, we did the opposite. They are not first-class citizens. Epics are not first-class citizens in GitLab. They are issuables. Everything in the code is repeated in the sidebar, in the system notes. The fact that we did promote Epic in one shot is because, and I've made promote Epic like the worst MVC. Like, it would be like something like you would complain for sure. And the fact, but then Yarka went in and just did it, and like we got everything for free, right? The system notes. Like the labels were promoted, the links were promoted, everything we got there for free, and that's because we did small primitives. So like I'm following your arguments, but I like to follow.
So then let's clarify here. So
your points, right? I want to qualify that example is not valid in my opinion.
So let's figure out how to get on that same page there, because I think it's absolutely valid. And I think when we've argued this before, you haven't quite said it as it is a small primitive. You have said, yeah, you've shared code that it's an issuable. I don't know that that's the same thing as saying it's a small primitive. When epics were released, they didn't have an API. They didn't have,
That's not the criteria of a small primitive. I think the criteria of a small primitive is more component-wise, right? Like, there's these benefits of small primitives, yes, but well, maybe we have to go back and define what a small primitive is. But per your definition, per our conversation, I understand small primitives is it's really, we're building on top of our existing components in whether it's in the product.
I think you're confusing the fact that there's polymorphism and saying that it's a small primitive. And I agree that there's polymorphism going on, that there's a class hierarchy and you have shared some code. That does not mean it's a small primitive.
Please continue.
So small primitives have been things like, I've got a lot of examples on the CI/CD.
I think labels, you would agree. Labels for issue boards, I think you would agree on that one. Like
exactly, that's a great small primitive where we said we took this, this existing construct of labels and said we're just going to make issue boards as another representation on the same, the same data. It's just a really, really small thing. And then we had to extend it in lots of different ways. Issue boards had to grow up, but they were instantly usable for some definition of usable on day one because they had some core functionality and like all the labels already existed. All that, all that, like we didn't have to add a new concept of what a column header was or all these other things. Like we just had labels and, anyway, it made the whole thing faster to get there. I'm not sure if I can explain it any better than that, but maybe we need more time to dive in. But I am going to assert that epics were not small primitives, that we did not execute in the way that I'm describing.
Right. Okay.
And in fact, in some ways with these workflows, you've even said underneath, we might still make them labelable or whatever it is, and you might still implement them using polymorphism, but the way you're approaching it is still not treating it as a small primitive.
Okay. So sorry, I keep interrupting you, Mark. That's a personal thing I have to do.
It's okay.
I'll interrupt you with 5 minutes left because I want to talk about next steps. But
okay, fair enough. So in my mind, I just see a path where you, the end result, I think, will look the same, roughly speaking. Not the same, that's wrong. Similar in terms of quality, in terms of effect, to the user. Meaning, like, you're still gonna have a sidebar where these workflows are pulled out as separate fields. But it might be more generic done so that, like, oh, well, any key value pair is pulled out there, but some of them are an enforced workflow with a sequence, but some of them aren't. Whereas if you go the other direction, like, I'm not saying it's going to be the same design, but the point is it's the same level. Like, so when we talk about using label sets and you say, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of like UI work that we do, I'm like, well, that, like, the same amount of effort can be done on either side. Like the UI, I expect we will put this, like, we'll put a high bar for UI. But one of the big differences, though, is when do you have to put that high bar in for UI? If you build a first-class entity, well, then you have to build the UI before you can even manipulate it. Whereas you can make an iteration with the small primitives and say, look, we're not even going to have a UI. We're literally just going to use a convention of, foo : bar. And then we're just going to start enforcing that in some way, or we're going to start doing, whatever. Like, but you can decouple everything, and you can say, well, let's work on what's really critical for making workflows work. If in fact workflows are the most important thing, and about like an enforced workflow, meaning you can only go from one stage to another, then we could do all that with potentially, I'm not saying this is a good idea, but we could potentially decouple all the UI changes from that and just like say, well, let's just enforce it in the back end first and make sure that happens, and then make a UI, which means you might be able to deliver value sooner than later. So I think that there's value in decoupling. It allows you to iterate faster and deliver value faster, and then also have leverage. In particular, what I would actually propose is that you don't, in fact, do custom workflows first. That you really just say, well, look, if we just do label sets first and just have a key value pair, and let's leave it unconstrained and say, fine, you can go and you can define your label sets where everything has to go in a certain order, but we just won't enforce that yet. But honestly, you'll deliver a ton of value to those teams that really, I just want to track it. Like, I trust my team to move the right direction. We can have enough process. Like, or even if, because here's the other argument too, but this is a tangent, is that even for custom workflows, everybody's like, oh, but this thing we found here, I need to go back 3 steps. Don't make me go and, like, I can do 1 step and then I have to do the next step and then the next step and then I can go back. Like, screw it, I just want to be able to jump back there. Let's do the flexible, trusted thing first, and then get to the custom workflows where you want to lock it down and you only enforce it. Like, oh, well, here, like, if you want to go from here to here, you need to have an approval process, et cetera, et cetera. But all that can be built on top of labels just as easily as they could be built on top of a first-class citizen. But we can defer all that by just saying, we're going to do this smaller primitive first that will, in fact, get you probably 80% of what you want, but will also get 80% of what 5 other people want because they have these other needs, and you made this really small primitive that was really, really flexible.
Can I interrupt you, Mark? I want to take the next steps. So I'll let you know the update you on the latest. So per our OKR, we said that we wanted value stream mapping, I think like MVC of it sometime this year. So we moved custom fields lower in priority, and then we bumped up VSM. And then we've also, Eric suggested, why don't you just like call custom workflows MVC or VSM, which is a great idea to satisfy the OKR. And so that's always been in the plan. And because of this OKR, custom fields was always higher priority, but we swapped. And so the current plan is in 11.10, we will start work on custom workflows before this meeting. That is the current plan. With 4 minutes, I wanted to qualify that I have responses to everything that you said. And so I'm not agreeing with you, and don't take my science as that, but I want to move forward and per OKR. So what I would suggest is that instead of, we actually go back to our previous plan and we actually action on key value labels right now in 11.10. and we continue to have this discussion, right? And so that buys us time, as it were, and then it jives with your small pyramids concept. I would right now I'm still disagreeing that key value labels goes to VSM, but I would be like, 70% okay it going to custom fields. I would be 0% okay going to VSM, but at least we have some functionality I think that you would agree with. And then you could probably argue this 30% of my disagreement with custom fields anyways. So that seems like a good way to proceed. And, if you want to get rigorous with OKRs, I don't really care about that too much. Then we could put this under VSM, but we're always changing anyway. So I think from that perspective, it's okay.
I wouldn't let that impact the decision process.
Right. So if we sort of swap back and just go back to our original plan and say, let's do key value labels because it was going to award custom fields, but now at least Mark is a big proponent of key value labels going to VSM, and then we'll just leave it at that, and then we'll continue to have this conversation. And then we don't have to make that decision, at least for one milestone. And, we'll still actively argue and debate. I think we should do that. And, one of my asks for you, Mark, is just to define small primitives. I see it in the handbook as in our product handbook. I don't see a clear definition. But do you think that's a good next step so that we can still move forward, but we don't have to? What?
Right. I think that's expedient. There are two risks that I'd like to see addressed, and we only have 2 more minutes. So maybe the first question is, do you mind going into the group conversation? And we can skip that and watch it later, and we can talk for another 30 minutes.
I can do that.
I want to just try to wrap it up now, because I think that there's still some big unknowns that I'd love resolved.
Okay, so why don't we agree on that decision for now? So that's the latest decision. Do you agree with that? Like the moment that we have to drop off because we're in this heated debate, the moment we drop off, that's a decision which we,
Okay, that's fair. That sounds good. So the two things that scare me about the decision are, one, I don't want you changing your plans without agreeing. My goal is to convince you, not to berate you into doing it, right? I don't want you doing this just because I clearly care about this and I've been talking with you about this for months and you're giving in. It's not how I want this to happen.
Well, no, I'm definitely not giving in. I mean, for custom fields, I don't know if I'm giving in, but I see the other side of the argument. I think there's a stronger argument to be made, but I'm definitely not giving in here. So that's
okay.
I think what he's saying is like let's do some other like really high value work that we all agree on that needs to get done,
right?
And continue this conversation.
Right, but yeah. So I can use the next 30 minutes to continue that conversation.
Okay, so let me just make sure I just really understand those. So what you're saying is, okay, key value stuff is high value. So let's do it. It may or may not actually solve the custom workflows challenge.
Exactly.
But to some extent, we're saying that's okay because we really want to focus on VSM. You're not yet convinced that this does solve VSM, but even if it doesn't, it's still valuable. So who cares?
It's still valuable, and
we have an MVC and it's defined and we can move forward.
Exactly,
so
and it's a prior, it's a category, it's a high category, it's not high category, it's a priority item anyways. So the downside is that if it doesn't become VSM, then we've lost that. That's the only downside.
It's just an opportunity, but that's okay. That's not a good reason not to. It's valuable. There's also some downside where it doesn't become even custom workflows, but it's still valuable all on its own because key value pairs are valuable.
Exactly.
And we have the upside where it might, in fact, do both of these things.
Right.
And so
you're
convinced enough to say, let's prioritize that.
Exactly. Multiply all those uncertainties together. Like right now, in my mind, the worst case is you make me do this and you against my will, but that's a probability, but that's still okay. Like the expected value of all that, that's still okay because we still move forward in the grand scheme of things, right? So,
right. The worst case is actually that we do nothing because we just churn.
There you go.
We don't
So we believe, I think we all believe in iteration. So let's find the thing that we.
Okay, so you're at least convinced that that's valuable. Great. So let's move on then. The second thing was just, and maybe I should just retract it and back off, but I would like it if whatever we're doing here works towards VSM, because I agree that VSM is a great priority. And I believe that in terms of, a really, really high level, right? But if we just said, we've got custom workflows versus we've got VSM, I would rather deliver VSM because I also believe VSMs are custom workflows, but custom workflows imply certain subtleties like, oh, it's about enforcing workflows. Whereas you could do VSM without enforcing anything and just say, look, no, we're just
custom workflows doesn't have to be enforced workflows.
No, exactly. But as soon as you go down that, like there are certain assumptions, and like if you set a goal here,
okay,
by a certain term, you'll start marching towards a certain thing. If you set a goal to VSM, you'll march ever so slightly differently. And I don't know exactly what choices we will make differently, but it's better to say our goal is VSM. Our goal is that not only we're not going to just be viable this year, we want to actually dominate and have like if there were a Gartner report again or a Forrester Wave or whatever, that we would be in the top right quarter for VSM. I believe that we have that potential. And I believe that it's important. I believe that it actually is an evolution to a lot of things that folks are already dealing with, and it solves sort of tons of problems. It solves like a project management problem, but it also solves like even a CI/CD pipeline kind of thing, but it also solves like potentially like, bringing in like marketing into the value stream. Like, okay, it's not just when you release it, but like there are 5 steps after you release it that all still part of delivering value. So I really love focusing on the value stream. So I absolutely believe that there is a world where labels are a key part of the value stream, but it's not the only way, and I'm not sure it's the best way. I would love to have a strong vision for how we're going to get to VSM, what is really required, and then sort of work backwards and be like, does this small primitive get us there, or does this small primitive sort of get us one step, but it's actually painted us in the corner and it doesn't? So I'll get a little bit more concrete. I can easily imagine a world where you've got labels that you can apply to epics or issues, and those labels, you could define, a stage or a stream or whatever the heck it is. You could define one of those labels and say, okay, great. Like I'm going to put all my categories of labels in there. I could define an order to those labels. I can maybe even have, some other way, although this now gets a little bit blurry, because part of the thing about value stream is like there's the horizontal stream, and then there's also vertical sort of waste, right? Or things that don't necessarily produce value, but stuff that has to get done anyway. I don't know how labels works in sort of a two-dimensional thing, because labels are sort of by definition one-dimensional. But we could do some kind of VSM where like, you've got this one key, and as you change the values, it moves along some stream. So I could see that being a pretty good value stream mapping tool. And then you can go further and say, well, let's automate some of these things where like when you deploy, we'll automatically have some automation that sets a value. And then that will then trigger it to move along the thing. And I'd love to get to a point where then like the value stream mapping isn't some person manually dragging things back and forth, but you're like, you could just actually sort of just watch it. Like you create an issue and you just watch this thing move all as it goes. And then of course, once you've done that, then you can add timing calculations to it, and you can start measuring, how long it is there. You can do your cycle time analytics on the entire cycle time, or your value stream analytics on the entire value stream. So I can imagine some world where that works. But there's a couple of caveats that I don't have answers for. One is this vertical thing. Like if a big part of value stream is that you've got other activities that happen in a stage that are non-value, like you don't move it between a stage, how the hell do you capture that? And I genuinely don't know. Maybe it's with additional labels. So like you'll have a label for the stage, and then you have another label for different steps within that stage, maybe. And then maybe each one of those stages has their own labels. So they all have a unique set of things. I don't know. How do you enforce the things can only go in one direction? How do you enforce that there's like checks and balances? Like it's great to have automation that says when this is deployed, move it from one to the other. But how do you make sure that, but it can only be deployed when it's been approved? We have other mechanisms for that, but I imagine people will put additional requirements on like something that's outside the system. Like this can only be approved when the press embargo has been relaxed, and then we do this, and like, well, what's that? Is that time-based, whatever? And there's going to be all sorts of rules around there that then get harder to layer on to labels. So I could also imagine an alternate world where we say, throw away the label concept and just say that value stream, define these stages and just define a bunch of rules. And it's a lot more complicated, but the rules could be like, if the status of the issue is this, and the status of the merge request is this, and the status of the deployment is this, then it goes into this category. And I don't know if this is a good idea. I'm not proposing it seriously at the moment, but if we have a different vision for VSM that basically says depends on things that are far different than labels, then do we need to jump to that other thing? And then let's work backwards and say, what's the MVC? Okay, what's the simplest of rules? Maybe the simplest of rules is, well, let's just depend on labels because that's the thing we have. But the point is it's rule-based, and we're now defining the columns based on rules and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I don't want to go too much down a solution. What I want to get to, though, is that if we have a vision for what VSM looks like, then we can go back and say, okay, does this help us? Or will this only go so far? And then are we stuck? And that's the question I'd love to have answers to.
So is that your contention that our vision of VSM is not clear enough right now, therefore it's inhibiting some of the decisions currently?
Well, that's putting a very pointed thing. I think I don't know what the vision is, and I don't know how.
Well, I can tell you that the vision right now, when you say vision, I mean, you keep using the word vision, but what you've described to me is simply a design. And
Sure.
So we have a design right now for how VSM will work. It is definitely not to the degree as you specified it. So and I'll tell you what the vision design is. It's simply, there's multiple stages and you know the time between each, and you calculate the average and you show it, like what you showed in the Series D thing, right? So it's simply that. And so if your contention is that is not sufficient to drive the decisions right now, I'd gladly, do additional homework, work with designers, talk with customers. And if you think that's the right path to it, or maybe you think that I should do that anyways, regardless.
I think absolutely we should do that. I think the reason I keep saying vision is to differentiate from, there's an MVC.
Right.
And maybe what you described as an MVC, but probably, frankly, that's...
Well, no, it's not an MVC. I mean, it's not an MVC because it's so much functionality beyond...
Exactly right. So it's something beyond an MVC.
Exactly. And if you want to call that vision, that's sure.
But I think...
But obviously, in addition to the design, it addresses the customer problem. I mean, that's... Of course. I would hope that's what a vision means. It's more than just a design of functionality. It's, why is this a good thing? What are your customers asking for? Why is this set us up for success? Yada yada yada. So of course that, and I think in the GitLab spirit, we're transparent and we try to identify with some level of detail the future so that we can elicit feedback. So if that's what you're saying, I totally agree, and that could be a great next step. But I just wanted to clarify: is that what you're saying?
So I think. There's a couple different lenses I can look at through here. One is there's like a short-term, medium, long-term kind of thing, but maybe to bring it back, we also have these definitions of maturity, right? Minimal, viable, complete, and lovable. And it's really critical that we obviously define the minimal, short-term, design or whatever really, really well. And a lot of times that's totally enough. We just say, great, let's just do one thing at a time and we will learn as we go.
Right.
But sometimes it's really valuable to say, but here's what we expect, or here's a potential world of, this is what it looks like when it's...
Yeah, one possible future, right?
One possible future, because that helps you understand...
Totally agree, yeah.
The direction, et cetera. So I think what you've described is a medium-term future. Right.
Exactly. The long-term future does not have enough fidelity.
Right, so I don't know if this exactly snaps to grid, but like maybe what you've described is the viable world, right? This is viable. There's going to be some MVC first. We're going to reach that, and we're going to get the viable. And once we have these stages and you can measure that, that's a viable feature. What's it got to look like before it's complete or lovable? And I don't normally want to encourage people to spend too much time thinking about this stuff and get distracted by the other stuff, because again, we're not going to know once we try somewhere else.
Right.
But it would help me have an understanding of, but here's the longer term vision of where we're going. And that's why I use the word vision. Just it's about time
to imply there's some gray versus.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. This is for sure what the thing's going to look like, but this is what it's got to look like before. It's like, wow, what's the vision for when it's going to be lovable? How are we going to make this thing lovable?
Okay.
And again, it's not prescriptive. It's clearly going to be fuzzy. It's going to be wrong. Right. But I want to have an understanding of, so to get specific, you talked about, okay, it's going to have these stages and you're going to measure. My assumption though, is that with those stages, it's all manual. Like I'm manually moving something. I'm manually setting a stage. Well, that's great, but that's clearly not going to be in the lovable category or even the complete category, right? The whole point of why I'm excited by VSM is that we own the whole DevOps life cycle. And so therefore we can actually just automate. Like, why should anybody manually move something to say, oh, this has now been deployed? We know it's been deployed. It should be automatic. So automation is an important part before this is complete. There may be other starts, but in the lovable bucket, I would even go farther and say, like, it'd be awesome to detect that something was deployed, and then therefore it moves from one stage to the other. But can you imagine if I actually could take that block and just literally drag it to the column, and then actually triggered the deploy? Like, we actually had enough fidelity to say, oh, this is ready to move. Great, move it to the next step. And with one click, I set the status to say it's now deployed, but it actually it triggered the deploy. And then it did whatever else it needed to do. I don't know what it would take to get there. And I don't want to answer what it would take to get there. What I want to make sure though is the direction that we have for the short term a step on the way to the direction we have to the lovable long term? Or is it going to paint us in a corner where we can't get back? That's literally, is it a one-way door or a two-way door, right? And as long as it's a two-way door kind of thing, it's like, oh, this is a step, and we can evolve it, and we can make labels work somehow. We can make stages, we can make workflows, whatever it is, we can make it work somehow. As long as we know that it can be somehow, then I feel like we can move on. But I want to see what that vision is so that I want to make sure we're on the same page, but everybody, our customers, whatever, like, when you paint that picture of a lovable version, do people get it and say, yes, I absolutely want to buy that. That is amazing. And then be like, great, now here's the MVC, and it is in that same direction. I just want to make sure it's not a direction that's off on a tangent. I don't want to say like, yeah, we're going to do all this stuff, and then 6 months later, we're going to like, okay, that was a dead end. And again, if it turns out to happen to be a dead end, then so be it. But if we know ahead of time it's a dead end, let's not do the 6 months in the wrong direction. Be like, no, here's this direction. We need to get to there. And again, once you've painted that vision, if we talk about this automation, this two-way automation, if we can apply that to labels, awesome. But if we say, you know what, there's a better primitive, there's a better small primitive that we could do that's something else that would actually get us there better, faster, then that's where, like, great, let's do something else. And label sets still might be valuable, but like no longer related to VSM, in which case maybe we totally deprioritize them and everything. But again, let's ship them now. That's great. Let's do them. But I would love to have this idea of where's VSM going? What's the long-term lovable vision for VSM? And then what's the MVC that gets us towards there?
I think my only concern with that approach is essentially like we painted ourselves into like a lack of action or a lack of bias for action until we have like a lovable design or vision, which goes kind of against like the iteration value, because now you've linked iteration with like what the end goal is. So I'm having a hard time like rationalizing those two things in my mind right now as you're talking.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And we certainly have to make sure that we avoid that scenario. The request for a longer term version should absolutely not in any way inhibit us shipping MVCs, which is why I think Victor's great in saying like, yeah, but let's just do label sets. We've got something to work on now. We will do that. And it might work out, it might not, but it's valuable and we will move forward. We will keep our velocity up and we will do that. So I absolutely do not want the result of this to be, oh, we've got to think harder about it and then not ship. That's not the request, right?
Yeah.
But I do want to start injecting a little bit more rigor into what we choose to invest in and what directions we go on, and not sort of have like a Brownian motion, like, oh, any idea in our head, let's just, as long as it's small, we keep writing on it. I'm not saying anybody's doing that, but I know we don't want to have undirected thing. The point of having a direction is to align to that and say, great, let's move forward. And so I just think that is a good way to frame it. If we talk about it from a higher level and what the long term is, it'll make the smaller term just much more efficient.
Yeah, and I think there is value to like asking this question each time we want to do something, right? And this is really going to impact plan the most. Like if any stage, this is going to impact plan. And the primary reason is because we're going to compete against Jira or CollabNet or version 1 or whatever it is. And we're going to have all these legacy enterprise customers that are used to doing things in that piece of software. And we have to take a hard look at things and understand how do we service the needs of those customers as we get customers to move to Jira. Obviously, Jira provides first-class custom workflow objects. They provide first-class custom fields. Now, under the hood, I don't know if those are actually like surfaced via small primitives or polymorphism, chunks of reusable code or whatnot, but at least to the user, they're displayed as first-class objects. And so something else we should probably consider is one of your arguments, which actually is like interesting, and this is why this conversation is so difficult, is because like there are like amazing points on both sides, and I'm just like I don't know, like I don't know what the right answer is, because like you could theoretically do everything that like Victor's proposed in custom workflows, like with labels, like today, without the enforcement, I guess. But like then you could just add that. Like you could just have an MVC to just say like, hey, enforce like a label ordering, and you'd have it done. But then the question becomes like, is that something like that's actually usable by a customer? Like, is that an intuitive enough process for a customer to grok that and then to use it, and then for enterprises to feel it's robust enough to use as well? And like I would probably argue like the answer to that is no. So,
but a really critical part there though is that, great, as soon as you get that answer, then you iterate. And like, let's say you do the MVC. I'm not saying you stop, right? I'm saying you do label sets, you don't do enforcement, you don't do these other things, then see how it works. And then when somebody says, okay, great, but this is really hard to use, but what you'll get is some portion of your folks, and honestly, it might be as simple as like, the intermediate to advanced users will figure it out and they will tell us about the capability, but then nobody will be a new user who hasn't touched this stuff. So they'll just be confused and we'll have a huge problem with our onboarding. And then we can figure out how to do the onboarding. But if you at least make it really functional so that some people love it, like honestly, GitLab CI YAML is really complicated, yet people love it because it's incredibly powerful and expressive, and they can do whatever they want. But it's not obvious. There's no like GUI that tells you like, oh, do this here. Like we have a linter, but like it's not even real time. But don't you think figure it out?
Don't you think the reason for that though is a different persona? Like you're not going to have a project manager going into that YAML file.
So exactly. So here's an interesting twist on this, right? One way to look at, let's say you even do VSM, and I'm just throwing this as an idea. I know that our ultimate customer is the project manager, but then also like the executive, somebody who's going to want to be able to do this stuff really easy at a really high level. But there's also a slice of it where like, even as a development team, we want to measure this stuff. Like we've got a quality team where Mac is doing a ton of analytics to dive deep into how the development team is performing and doing measuring on this. And if we gave him these small primitives, he would solve it. He would dive through whatever the headache it was, figure it out, use it in amazing ways, especially if we gave him small primitives. If we could give him some timing on labels, adding and deleted and whatever, like we would figure this stuff out. We would get some use. It wouldn't necessarily be our ultimate persona, but we would get some use today. And then we can extend to the ultimate persona. I don't disagree, but I just feel like smaller printers they're not great for onboarding. They're not great for the non-technical, but that's not even quite right, because depending on what the small primitive is, it might be a non-technical primitive. But the point is that it's like they're saying use about like, we use Markdown. We could throw that out. Somebody was talking about the other day that like,
yeah. The usage increased completely when they threw out Markdown.
Right. So the whole thing is like, we could get rid of Markdown because that's better for people, but we've tied on to, yeah, but developers love it. And I want to at least have somebody love it. If you gave me label sets, I would love it. A ton of people at GitLab would love it. A ton of some section of like the very technical project managers would love it. And then they'd give us some feedback on real usage and we would learn. And if we could do that faster, Then we can say, great, now what do we need to do to make it easy? What do we need to do to really kill Jira? Like, because we could even be like, well, we're the project management tool for really technical developers. But that's still a niche that's worth getting. And then we expand out to the next niche of, okay, but now we're the project tool for project management.
I agree with your ideas in principle, but for the Jira part, I think this path is actually slowing us down in competing with Jira.
I agree, but I think that's a good thing.
That's fine. I'm just commenting on that.
Yep.
Like very, very clearly, your approach here, I think, is low risk. It's not, and I think it's not risky enough. The concept of leverage, right? And then we're not attacking the problem specifically. You're allowing for multiple paths, as you explained it, and then we're not addressing the problems head on. And then, as I argue, that these problems have been manifested with labels already. So to me, it's clear that the risk analysis that you provide, I think, is not, leads me to believe that this should be done as a first-class abstraction, because the purported benefits of leverage, as you described it, are not sufficient given the negatives that I've seen already. So that's why I agree in principle, but I disagree in this particular scenario.
And my counter to that is that I think that I understand that there are some complications with the UX, but I also believe, this is why I started this whole thing of saying, we can still get to the same quality of UX through either direction.
No, that's just not true, right? Like labels as a concept, if you're defining small primitives as something above the code, labels will always be labels, and you always have to expose that to a user. And when you're saying that, that is always going to be additional complexity of the label object. So you cannot just say we can just iterate, and then when the concept of, if you're overloading labels to mean something beyond just tagging something, by definition, that is a UX cost, or maybe not a cost, but an additional thing that a user has to account for, and you cannot UX that away. That's my contention.
Maybe we need to dig in, but this is not the right time. But I think that there are ways you can do it, and I think the risk is more just that we stop short because we have something that's functional, and so then we don't make the easy to use UX, we don't do the rest of the stuff, and that's totally a very real risk.
The opportunity cost is we're not taking out Jira. I mean, the risk is both ways, right? What you've illustrated is the risk of we're building the wrong thing. We can iterate toward it. We use small primitives, so on and so forth. The opposite risk, or the opportunity cost, as it were, is we're not tackling the problems that our sales team is telling us we should.
So okay, now you're bringing back Jira. So I want to close out one thing. I think from a UX perspective,
I'll let you have the final word, Mark.
Yeah, we should probably have a second. I have to drop, but this has been awesome. Like, we should keep pushing through this together. But yeah, I got to prepare for an interview, so I'll talk to you a little bit later.
All right, cool. See ya. Anyway, just to close out these two specific things, I think from a UX perspective,
not close out, Mark. I'll let you have the last word for this video, but they're definitely not done yet.
All right, fine. But specifically, we can continue to iterate on the UX. Just because we have a thing that's functional and minimal doesn't mean that we then need to stop. We can stop if we choose that the continued effort isn't worth it. But I think you can address those things. I think in the past, where we've had a lot of contention and confusion because we've overloaded things, I believe in my heart that there is a way to solve those things without having to we've got to throw it away. We've got to do it first class because that's the problem. We just need to put the effort in to solve the problem. But then specifically to get back to Jira, I think that there's also another failure mode sort of risk thing of like, if we really want to just compete with Jira, if that's the goal, then we end up like basically hitting feature parity and we just replace everything, but we just made Jira 2.0, or we just made Jira with a different brand. And that's not the goal. That's why I've been really careful not to say our vision is not to make Jira. Our vision is to make project management. And in particular, what I would like to say, and I need to formalize this somewhere, but like, if nothing else, I want to focus on project management for our like sweet spot of target user first. Like ideally, like the conversational development, people who bought into that. Like, let's make project management work amazing for them. And then the folks that do lean and then agile, and then do the legacy. Like, we want to do all this stuff. We know that we've got lots of customers that are doing safe. We know that there are lots of customers that are doing waterfall for that matter. And we eventually need to support them. But if we support them first, then we're going to go down the wrong path. And what I want to do is make a really modern thing and then see what our deltas are. I think that's really, really critically important. So I'm absolutely saying, let's go after Jira, but let's not delay going after project management. It's just that I want to focus on project manager, like even solve our own project management, solve conversational development project management, solve lean type of project management, which in those worlds, like constrained workflows are a lot less important because you have more trust and more conversation. But what is the value that they really want out of it? It's like visibility and reporting and measurements and all these other kinds of things. And we can do all that. Let's do that first and then see, well, okay, now what's missing? But also now really keep tying in the VSM. I don't know exactly how this works, but I just have this belief that if we make VSM, we actually have an interesting way to it's not like a new paradigm or whatever, but it's a different way of looking at project management. And if you start with the VSM and then say, great, now how do we go down a level and say, make project management work really well with VSM so that we can deliver on this value stream, you might end up coming up with a completely different set of tools. And you can also win against Jira by adopting sort of the next paradigm, but seeing maybe Jira is really amazing as long as you're only myopic at this part of software development, but software development's actually this. And we've solved this whole thing and we've done it better. And it's going to be so amazing that you will gladly throw away that other tool because we've got this amazing project management for VSM. And then have people try it and be like, okay, but there's this one little thing that's still missing. And be like, okay, is that really critical? And be like, well, actually, no, it's not. Fine. This other stuff is worth it. I just know so many times in my past where somebody will ask for a bunch of things because that's what's usual. And then you present them something else that's so much better, but doesn't have that. So I'm like, oh, I want that. Let's make the thing that is so amazing that they want that. And they're easily willing to give up these other things that they used to have.
Do you think, I'm going to continue. I'm not going to argue anything. I just want to ask a question. Yep. Do you think the plan vision as it stands, or as maybe you haven't had a lot of time to review it, do you think we're not doing enough of that, or we're just not doing that right now? Just everything you've described thus far. Just self-evaluation, purely.
So it's hard to say. It might all be there. I don't think it's. Let me phrase it this way. I do not know. What I just described as part of I don't know if that's captured in the plan vision. I don't know what your plan vision is, and I don't know if we're aligned.
Is that because you haven't had time to do the homework, or haven't had time to put things in your calendar, or is that just purely that's?
Well, one tactical thing would simply be that I don't necessarily want to look at a plan vision. I want to look at a vision for VSM, and I want to have that be really clearly articulated.
Okay.
And then a vision for project management.
I can say for sure that that's not done. Yeah. So right. Yeah, that's my homework for sure. Okay.
But I don't know, honestly, if it is buried in the plan and maybe it is really.
No, it's not. It's not. So I asked that just so I at least I can have some action items. So thank you.
Yeah. So those would be the two specific. If I want, plan is actually has two of the four key things that we want to do this year. Right, project management and VSM, and I would love to have a really compelling this is what we're doing for that, and that's true for the other two areas as well.
Right, and it tells with what you said, what we're doing is not detailed designs and guarantee we're going to do this, but it's a vision. And
honestly, I would love to even go further and be it's worth it to spend some time mocking up, not slow down delivery, but as a company, these are one of the four top items, right? And so I want to say, let's spend some time and paint a picture. This is what, do a mock-up flow, the same sort of fidelity that we did before, but how does VSM look? And let's paint that picture and get people really excited.
Another round of funding, and then we had to scramble and talk about this. Right. That can be the forcing function. Victor, there's another.
But honestly, there's an interesting parallel there because the previous round of funding, was an October time frame. And then it took me until February before I had a mock-up demo of this is what this is going to look like.
Right. And
then it took up until a couple of months ago before we actually started to have then the real versions of those things. Right. So we're in it's a little bit past February, but our funding announcement, right? We talked about the vision at a really high level. This would be a perfect timing to say, okay, but now this is what the fleshed out VSM and project management visions actually look like, and CD and
I think what I'm getting from you is, or I don't know if you're saying this, but what my what I want to do is that for these key areas, there should always be an ongoing revamp and updating of these longer term visions, because these are key strategic things. You know, for other things.
It's interesting. I don't know if they need to be like always revamped. The reality is, like, if you do a long-term vision once and then you start to have fidelity, I don't know if you then need to go back and update it and be like, okay, well, now that we've got this, let's change the color.
No, I mean, it should, like, we should always keep, like, if VSM, like, whatever the next thing is, maybe you're right. Like, it, obviously, I'm not going to do it every single day.
Oh, right. I see. Whatever these things are, yes, we'll have ongoing
keep pushing forward. Yeah.
When we identify the next big item that's going to get to complete or lovable, like, we should have a vision for how that thing's going to get to complete or lovable. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'll definitely get cracking on that. So I think that should all feed into this ongoing discussion. So it's a good thing to have regardless, but it will continue to have us have these debates, which we should continue to record.
We should, which is good. Actually, I want to tie one thing back.
Please.
Posterity, if nothing else, to one more thing, because we're already over time. Is that there definitely is this risk of saying, okay, well, we're going to go after long-term vision, and if we can't do anything until that's defined, that's really horrible. One of the things I love about small primitives, though, is that if I were to bet on, you know, whether a first-class thing versus the small primitive is more likely to solve this, I'm going to bet on the small primitive. And that's, I think, actually really important. I don't know for sure if label sets are going to help or be part of the VSM solution, but I would actually bet more on that than a custom workflow thing. Because the custom workflow thing, if we then are like, oh, but it turns out we need to add rules, and we're like, oh God, it's now brittle and it's going to be really hard. Whereas, like, hey, there's this small little primitive of label sets. It's the core of this thing, but let's add another small primitive about rules and automation. And we put those two things together, and then and then the automation actually works for several other pieces. And it may not be as beautiful as if we had come up with a holistic design, but these smaller primitives, like if we just have label sets plus automation, like, oh my God, what we could do with those things. And then probably can also do VSM. And so let's do it, even if it's a little uglier. The smaller primitives are just so much more leverageable and powerful and whatever. So I would bet on that, which is why I still love the net result is that we do the label sets and then we move forward, and hopefully they'll dovetail.
All right. So that's it. Thanks, Mark.
All right, cool. Thanks,
Talk to you
Victor.
next time. Bye now.
Yeah. Ciao.